This is the fourth of the Emeritus Academy talks this year. We have 4 more coming up, starting in February and going into May. The next one is on February the 7th. Bill Osage is going to talk about the fossil record of biosphere collapse and recovery. Really interesting subject, and I hope that all of you will come to hear that talk. I also want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences Digital Media Studio for videotaping this particular talk and all the other ones that we will have this year. And at some point, before too long, I think, we will be posting those on the website. So if you have relatives over for the holiday season and you want to show them what's going on at The Ohio State University, you should have them turn to that website and look at these talks. I also want to make sure that members of the Emeritus Academy stay for the business meeting. We'll have a very short business meeting, but we want to use it to introduce new members to the Academy. And there's a class of 9 new members, not all of whom are able to come today, but we will introduce them to you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Anna Soter. She is a professor emeritus of education, became a professor emeritus in 2012, same month that I did, by the way. She specializes in languages and literacy, and is not only a highly accomplished scholar, but she also is a prize-winning poet. So it's a really nice combination of both scholarly skills and actual creative ability. Not that scholarship isn't creative. Beyond the many honors she's received, she has received the coveted OSU Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching and is a member of the university's Academy of Teaching. She also is the founder of the Hospital Poets program here at OSU, and that's what she's going to talk to us about today. So please welcome Anna Soter.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody for coming. I am actually quite nervous, and that's always surprising. But then you are my colleagues and former colleagues, and so of course I want to do the best job in front of you, not strangers that I might normally do this with. Very briefly, you've just been given some handouts, a couple of pages, 2 of them. One of them is a poem that I'm actually going to read. And then I had a little experiment that I wanted to do with that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to conduct a similar experiment at another time. And the second handout is a little summary of some of the evaluations that we receive at the end of each medicine and the arts performance from participants who are right across the board, various members of the medical community, including students, medical students who get feedback every time there is such an event since 2012 when that program began. So welcome, and I will be sharing some poems with you, and you will not have copies of the other poems, and that is always the case with our hospital poet readings, because the goal is to rest the eyes and ignite the ears, and through that to also connect with the body. Since we have such busy minds, we tend to go to print before we do all those other things, and often don't end up doing them. So relax, and I will read this poem and ask you not to read it while I read it. Just sit back, take a deep breath, and allow the words as spoken to enter your bodies. Testimony. I want to tell you that the world is still beautiful. I want to tell you that despite children raped on city streets, shot down in schoolrooms, despite the slow poisons seeping from old and hidden sins into our air, soil, and water, despite the thinning film that encloses our aching world, despite my own terror and despair, I want you to know that spring is no small thing, that the tender grasses curling like a baby's fist, fine hairs around your fingers are a recurring miracle. I want to tell you that the river rocks shine like God, that the crisp voices of the orange and gold October leaves are laughing at death. I want to remind you to look beneath the grass, to note the fragile hieroglyphs of ant, snail, beetle. I want you to understand that you are no more and no less necessary than the brown recluse, the ruby-throated hummingbird, the humpback whale, the profligate mimosa. I want to say, like Nerida, that I am waiting for a great and common tenderness, that I still believe we are capable of attention, that anyone who notices the world must want to save it. That source for that poem is at the back of the handout that you have, including the sources for some of the other poems that I hope to get a chance to read, but I will be mindful of time to allow for questions. A brief introduction, oh God, technology, right, to the concept of language as a field of energy, which I actually connected to the work in poetry back many, many years ago, but didn't articulate until fairly recently in a paper that was published earlier this year on language as a field of energy, linking it up with quantum physics, by the way. This phrase, what does it mean, language as a field of energy? And then I'll connect that to poetry. I mean that language operates as a region or field in which a force is related, and I call it embodied, to what words represent, and which bring about some influence resulting in an effect or having an impact on our behaviours, as well as having the capacity to influence emotions and/or the course of events. In labelling something, the thing referred to and the label merge, thus endowing the label, meaning the word, itself with energy. That is, energy is a force. Now, there might be some physics folk here who might tremble at some of this, but we can have that conversation later. Furthermore, I see this energy as rhizomic in nature. One word triggers others. A sound psychologically, physiologically reverberates throughout our emotional, mental, and physical bodies. Renaming language as a field of energy physicalizes it through sound, rhythm, visual images in ways that act upon all of our senses. This, at least, is my hypothesis. Now, I am going to skip to as a field of energy. Joel Canaro, who has had a long history as a very significant person in the poetry field, argues that we find consolation in memorable language, singing in his mind. And I found that an interesting word to use, because singing is a physical act. It's not just a mental act. And therefore, once the voice is involved, the body is involved. The emotions also follow. He argues that poetry is capable of enfolding in one and the same breath the light, the dark, the odd, the familiar. In other words, putting flesh back on the skeletons being a word. A reminder of the richness that we're fast losing in the compressed reductionist era of, and this is my particular beef, e-communication. It is a feast of thought, experience, emotion, and intellect combined into one wonderful meal, and that is lost in much of e-communication, if not all, because the eyes do all the work. The kinesthetic power of language has been traditionally ignored, according to Gabriele Bigliocco, and her colleagues published publication in 2014. Her work is in the field of cognition and language research, and I thought her her findings were quite interesting. She notes that the integration of information from so-called secondary sources include face movements and gestures which are not visible on the page, but are when the body talks. Voices, perhaps we could use that word. Gestures, too, may play an integral role in language acquisition as well as its development. And when gestures are considered parallel to language per se, being shown to index changes in conceptual knowledge, things that we've often, I think, previously taken for granted. I'm going to hop through to, having said what I just said, a poem that I'd like you to listen to again, and thinking of it in terms of what the voice is doing and how it carries the rest. And this is a poem by Mary Oliver, very famous poet, in the area of poetry and well-being. She's often cited in pieces that are published in the Journal of Poetry Therapy. She's often used as a poet as a resource when people are deeply sad or depressed. Her poetry seems to lift us out of that. So here is a poem that actually moves me very deeply, and I hope I'll get through it without my usual trembling voice by the end. A visitor. My father, for example, who was young once and blue-eyed, returns on the darkest of nights to the porch and knocks wildly at the door. And if I answer, I must be prepared for his waxy face, for his lower lip swollen with bitterness. And so, for a long time, I did not answer, but slept fitfully between his hours of rapping. But finally, there came a night when I rose out of my sheets and stumbled across the hall. The door fell open, and I knew I was saved and could bear him, pathetic and hollow, with even the least of his dreams frozen inside him and the meanness gone. And I greeted him and asked him into the house and lit the lamp and looked into his blank eyes, in which at last I saw what a child must love. I saw what love must do. I saw what love might have done had we loved in time. The Hospital Poets, birthed in 2012 with an initiative by the College of Medicine when it launched its Humanism in Medicine and Medicine in the Arts program in 2010-11. Under the leadership of Professor Emerita Linda Stone, a remarkable woman, incredibly humble. The program is thriving, it is alive and well, and at the time, very well supported by the then Dean. It was a response to an increasingly widespread acknowledgement that the work of medical personnel across the board entails high levels of stress, which negatively affects their performance and potentially the quality of patient care. The first Hospital Poets reading birthed in 2001, and we average about 4 readings a year, different venues in the medical centre. And I'll just pause here for a moment, along with poetry, there's dance, there is also theatrical performance, there is an annual art show, there is even an antique car show which comes in under the heading of the arts. So the program is quite widespread. We've read at the James, the Stephanie Spielman Centre, the Ross Hart Hospital. Jack, you're here somewhere. forgotten where you moved, okay. Ophthalmology, Veterinary College, College of Medicine, Harding Hospital just recently, and the Ackerman Administration Centre. And interestingly, I find it really interesting that that particular community seems to be very excited whenever we're saying we're ready to come back for a visit. Do you want us again? And maybe that because it is the administrative wing, it tends to be sealed into these, glass boxes called offices. And perhaps poetry is indeed a resuscitator more than we might have given it credit for. It is currently co-convened with Fred Anderley and also Charlene Fix, my two colleagues, and we average about 4 readings a year. The criteria is basically that poets must be good readers. They really have to be performers. There's no point in having a poetry reading with your typical poet that might go to an average monthly reading in the poetry community. Not a mumbler and a stumbler and, but somebody who really knows how to engage an audience and to bring them alive with it. We also don't emphasize their own poetry. There is a tendency to do that, the poet, and bow and worship. If we bow and worship anything, we bow and worship poetry. And the poet is the deliverer. So that is a pretty golden rule. 2/3 of the poems that you read must be those of other poets. And then you may read up to 10 of yours if we have time. How am I doing for time? Okay. The focus of the hospital poets. It's basically on poetry and its power to move us from wherever we are to a space where we can re-enter, reconnect with ourselves as human, pause to embrace the beauty, find strength and solace, recharge our batteries, dip inner resources through the poems that are selected by the poet presenter. And I've never known one of the readings, disparate as they have been, to fail in achieving that. The emphasis is on the poet's personal readings, and we make it very clear this is not going to be analysis. We're not going to be deconstructing, like some people often will tell us, I was really scared of poetry when I was in school, and we had to get the meaning of it. This is soaking it in. And personal impact that the poems had on him or her. It's not about how significant the poet is on the scene, the academic scene as well as the literary scene. And the subjects are serious as well as light and humorous. And the intent is to take poetry off its academic pedestal and encourage attendees to see it as part of daily life, such as, for example, Joel Canaro has said that he makes sure he reads some poetry every single day. And there are many people who do, even secretly, in case they don't want to confess it. I think usually we read, I won't go through that first part, the structure, because I've referred to it, but we read about 12 to 15 poems, and that gives time for people to also respond. And it also gives time for the poems to be read thoughtfully and slowly, so the words sink in, which I hope is how they've been coming across to you. They occur in lunch hour, people coming and going. I did not see this as an event that should be everybody seated, stay put for the time, but a time when you come and go, brown bag, hospitals, anybody working in the medical complexes is incredibly busy in a way that even we, other academics, are not. They're always on the run. So even if it's 10 minutes, just come on in, sit down, relax, and hear the music. And some of the poets are well known in town: Fred Anderley, Charlene Fix, Maggie Smith, others less so. Mim Chenfield, probably many of you have heard of her. She is very, very important with children's work, children's poetry. John Rybicki, Cleveland, Jean Briner. We're having Steve Abbott and Scott Woods read this year. And in the process of it, the students in the medical school who also choose writing as one of the options, they have to choose the humanism option, also get to work with the hospital poets, and so experience it in their first year of medical school and continuously through their medical career at the beginning and not after they're done. Again, I think I'm just going to scroll through and move on because I would like to give you time for questions. Saturday football. If we have time, I might go back to it. And basically this notion of poetry as a field of energy, language as a field of energy, for me, was brought together because I'm an eclectic person. I read across the board. And so I read a great deal of literature since about the 1970s that is what I call loosely termed metaphysical. And I guess you could say loosey-goosey, some people have. But it is also about how language is more than just something to study. Language is more than just a linguistic phenomenon. It's also about the relationship between language and the lives that we lead and end up leading, whether we believe it or not. And a lot of work has been done by various people that I actually respect. For example, Lynn McTaggart, who I cite here, has done an enormous amount of work in that area with folks who work in physics. The starting point for me was also Lakoff and Johnson's work on metaphor and how metaphors work as containers that actually lock us into conceptual domains that we didn't even realize we were locked into. And metaphors being very powerful in that way because they're subtle and not literal. And we tend to take it for granted that when we say something using a dead metaphor, like when it rains it pours, it means nothing, but actually it does mean a great deal more than we think. And I do think that poets have always been sensitive to this peculiar facility of language to capture layers of meaning through composing qualities. And many people have talked about the relationships between language, poetry, and music. And music, of course, is a physiological as well as a mental experience. How many of us don't start tapping when we hear a song that we relate to, and the body starts moving and swaying, and before we know it, our bodies are engaged. And there is also something in the vibratory quality of language, like a musical instrument. It is a musical instrument in that way. And in the vibration is again another aspect of physicality when we actually sound the words of poetry, that physicality. So I'm not going to belabor the language and the beliefs and all of that because we've already gone there, and I want to move on to some work that's being done by various people like Baker and Mazza, that poetry seems to be an effective healing agent. And I will say this, that one of the slower moving aspects of this area is the very difficult challenge of pinning people down and being able to research them over time and to see whether or not what happens in the course of a reading, where they come out, and in the evaluations that I gave you, their words being used, they're recharged, revitalized, and they're uplifted, and how long does that last? And of course, can we really expect any one event to have a lasting impact? Certain events may well do that, and they do. Many of us know that for one reason or an experience and another. But one event like this tends to be, it has to be admitted to be more subtle. The longevity of it is something that we need to actually explore as researchers. And that is also very hard to pin down, and maybe this is where poets, we literary folk, have to collaborate with maybe neuroscientists, neurologists, to see whether or not there can in fact be a way of identifying what happens to the brain as well as to the body, and the relationship between the brain and the body in terms of poetry be tracked across time. And I find that absolutely fascinating, and potentially, I hope I last long enough to be able to be involved in some kind of a research project like that. And there is some work being done by James Pennebaker, the first author, and this analysis, the linguistic analysis word count, who's been working on trying to track that same sort of phenomenon in the area of expressive writing for a long, long time. He has started doing that in the UK back in the early 90s. And again, longevity is one of those very hard things to track in that area. It's elusive, but seems to be able to, seems to be developing an instrument using language to do that. As far as I know, it hasn't gone in the area of neurology. And let's just pause for a moment and let you soak in another poem. Have I got time for that? Okay. Edward Hirsch, Edward Hirsch is an amazing poet who's produced a phenomenal amount of work. And I find this particular poem of his recalls for me certain experiences that I will not share with you until I've read it. I felt it on Parents' Day in 1963 in a 7th grade classroom at Fairview School when my mother stepped into the corner of a winter afternoon, her dress stippled in sunlight by the snowy window. Something about the way she tilted her head to gaze down at the wire hangers and rubber balls that I had constructed as a science project on the notion of planetary bodies, pierced through me like a silver blade glinting in white sunlight, or a few haunting notes rising out of a late quartet on a sudden disturbing rage of happiness. And then I was lost. The light in the class dizzied overhead. A door in the hallway slammed somewhere far off, and I could hear the voice of a teacher calling to me in the distance, though in a moment I was lifted up and transported, spinning away from the room in a bright light, untethered from Earth, spiraling into another orbit. And as a mother, I certainly recall the time when I did notice my son's response to a look I had on my face. I hadn't said anything, it was just a look on my face to do with one of his projects. And if you could define bliss, that was bliss. Amazing. And he caught it in that particular poem. So, reading poetry aloud, I believe, activates the physicality of the words on the page. So it's an activation, reading it aloud. There is not only a mental and emotional response, but also a tangible physical response. The whole body becomes engaged. And frankly, although I love poetry, I mean, I have it at breakfast every morning. I often have it at night as part of my dinner if I'm alone. I don't think that works the same way when it's read silently. It is that voicing of it that makes the difference, that makes it so powerful in the Hospital Poets program. And that is what people respond to. An undergraduate from Boston University apparently invited Paul Muldoon, Pulitzer Prize winner, to try to bring the audience back to language and feeling after a week of the Boston Marathon bombings, who at the time experienced so much shock and awe. And Muldoon's reading apparently had this impact on Mendes, who previously, this undergraduate, but he previously had been unaware of the impact of voicing poetry. And in the process, he said, I felt transfixed. I was lost in the language of Muldoon's poem. I couldn't recreate this atmosphere by reading it silently to myself. And that, to me, is the key. That transformation, as it moves from the written to the spoken word, was an experience that Mendes would relive as his own guinea pig in an admittedly subjective study last spring through the undergraduate research program. And let me just close with sharing, yes, a last poem. For a particular friend. On a Minnesota afternoon in August, you could be anywhere, but you aren't, and it can only be here on the shores of this particular lake in northern Minnesota, where the light mutes the jaggedness of this time, the lake's calm measuring yours. Those years professoring, a crown you no longer need if you ever did. Those students, those colleagues with whom you held your own, your knowing sidereal glance, your tempered kindnesses, fed each day by a loving wife and family, your dogs determined to last you out. Fear has fled where it cannot roost. You call to us as the loons do, nudging us to the lake's open waters, you circling our peripheries. Someone nearby flings, casually, a flat blue stone that skips its tune across the pond, an old child's game that draws your quiet smile. Paling leaves drift to forest floor, begin the autumnal cycle. Lady slipper petals, rain-drenched spiral droplets. The earth and you shiver, quiet attention. The loons hoot to gather their chicks, chorus retreat from grassy banks. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes.